So good afternoon, dear students. Myself Joydeep Sen, and I am here today to discuss two of Sylvia Plath's most important poems. One is Daddy, and another is Lady Lazarus. Now, Sylvia Plath, as you know, was a famous American poet, novelist, and short story writer. Now, before we start discussing her poems, let us look at her life and works. Now, much needs to be said regarding her life, but I would rather like to focus on the role of her father and of her husband, as because that would help us to understand her poems, especially Daddy. Now, that's Sylvia Plath for you. And she was born on October 27, 1932, in Boston, and she was the daughter of the German immigrant college professor Otto Plath and one of his students, Aurelia Schober. Now, see, when Plath was only 8 years of age, her father died prematurely, leaving her emotionally bereft. And Otto Plath's authoritarian behavior and his death defined Plath's relationships and her works. Now, Plath met Ted Hughes. Plath was a brilliant student, and she went to Cambridge University, and there she met Ted Hughes, a famous British poet. They fell in love, got married in 1956, but finally separated in 1962. The marriage was not a happy one. Plath suffered from manic depression for most of her life, and she had to undergo psychiatric treatment also. On February 11, 1963, Sylvia Plath, 30 years old, finally succeeded in committing suicide. She attempted to commit suicide before also, but she failed. And this time she succeeded in committing suicide by inhaling gas from a kitchen oven. Now, regarding Sylvia Plath, I should want to make it very clear that she was one of the most famous confessional poets. And these two poems, Daddy and Lady Lazarus, are both written in a confessional mode. Now, what do you exactly mean by confessional poetry? Now, let's see. Now, before that, just I like to discuss a bit about her work. That Daddy, Lady Lazarus, Moon and the Yuchi. These are the poems that are so very famous. And then you have a semi-autobiographical novel called The Bell Jar, and the collection of her poems, Ariel and the Colossus, made her very popular. And among other notable works, you have The Winter Trees, you have a very good collection of short stories, that is Johnny Panic and the Bible of Dreams, etc., etc. Now, Sylvia Plath and confessional poetry. Now, confessional poetry is the poetry of the personal or I. So it is mostly autobiographical and private experiences and feelings about death, trauma, depression, relationships. These were addressed in this kind of poetry. And also that included mental illness, sexuality, suicide, and confessional poetry, as you can see in this slide, was first identified in the decades immediately following the Second World War. So, among the major poets, you have Sylvia Plath, Theodore Ritke, and Sexton. Plath's work often considered autobiographical. Why? Because in Daddy and also in Lady Lazarus, you will find that Plath is sharing her, you know, personal experiences with the reader, and she lets her reader peep into her personal life. You can see her relationship with her dad, with her husband in this poem Daddy. Then in Lady Lazarus, you will see her speaking about her failed suicide attempts. So this is how she is sharing her personal experiences with her readers, and also about her sufferings, pain, and her search for self-identity, reaction against patriarchy. So everything she shares without any pretension. So that makes Plath a confessional poet, and these two poems are seriously confessional poems written in confessional mode. So now let us concentrate on Daddy. Daddy is one of the most controversial poems of Sylvia Plath. It was written on October 12, 1962, 4 months before Plath's death, 1 month after her separation from her husband Ted Hughes. Posthumously, it was published in Ariel. There are 16 stanzas written in quintains and irregular meter and irregular rhyme. Yeah, major themes of love, hatred, loss, death. Now, Daddy remains one of the most controversial modern poems, and it is addressed to her father. And her father, I just told you that he died at the age of 40 when Plath was 80 years of age. And though her father is dead, his spirit lives on. And Otto Plath, Sylvia Plath's father, has such a hold on her mind. She cannot, free herself from the grasp of her father. So, this is a poem addressed to her father, and in Sylvia Plath's own words, here is a poem spoken by a girl with an Electra complex. Now, what do you mean by Electra complex? As proposed by Carl Jung in his theory of psychoanalysis, Electra complex is a girl's psychosexual competition with her mother for possession of her father. It's a love, attachment, inclination towards her father, which is very deep rooted. And a boy's analogous experience is the Oedipus complex. So, what Sylvia Plath herself says, that Here is a poem spoken by a girl with an Electra complex. Her father died while she thought he was God. Her case is complicated by the fact that her father was also a Nazi and her mother very possibly Jewish. In the daughter, the two strands marry and paralyze each other. She has to act out the awful little allegory once over before she is free of it. So she wrote this words while speaking on her poem Daddy. Now, this poem can also be considered as a poem of exorcism. An exorcism, is an expulsion or attempted expulsion of an evil spirit from a person or place. Now, here, Plath is trying to free herself from the grasp and influence of her father. She wants to come out of his shadow. So, this can also be read as a poem of exorcism, and it directly addresses her father. And the first line, she says, you do not do any more black shoe. Now, let me show this to you. Daddy, Sylvia Plath. You do not do any more black shoe. So, she compares her father to a black shoe. You cannot dominate me anymore. I'm not going to be dominated by you, in which I have lived like a foot for 30 years, poor and white, barely daring to breathe or achoo. So she says that she has lived inside that black shoe like a foot for 30 years. 30 years of her life. And she could not, breathe or sneeze even because of the overbearing personality of her father. And though he be dead, he always seemed to be omnipresent. So that is what she says in the first stanza. In the second stanza, she says, "The daddy, I have had to kill you." She's trying to escape his influence, but she cannot. You died before I had time. No. Here she blames her father. She used to think of her father as, as a god. But when she needed him the most, he was not there. So her love, attachment towards her father, it gradually changed to bitterness. It became bitter. And now she sees her father as something evil. Now let me tell you about imago. Imago is a psychoanalytic term, and that means that the imago of the father means the childhood version of the father which persists into adulthood. So that is the imago. And she says that he died before I had time. Marvel have ye a bag full of God. Costly statue, one great toe, big as a Frisco seal. Such a dominating personality, overbearing personality, authoritarian, strict father he used to be. But still he used to love his daughter. And she can only free herself by killing her daddy now. And she says that his story is as big as a Frisco seal. Now, Frisco seal refers to one of the sea lions that can be found in San Francisco. And the grotesque image of her father that has fallen like a statue. Then she continues and says that there's a mix of actual and fictional in the fourth stanza, where she says that uh, the town where her father was born, and Otto Plath was born in Grabel, Poland, but she says that this kind of town, they have a similar name and was razed and demolished during the Second World War by the Nazis. Now, this is very important. What do you mean by Nazi? Who are the Nazis? The Nazi, a member of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, and the leader of the Nazis was Adolf Hitler during the Second World War. And, they tortured, murdered, and mutilated the Jews in the concentration camps. So the brutality and horror unleashed by the Nazis, you know, cannot be expressed in words. So here she, says this, that she refers to the war, and then she says, she continues to describe the way she felt around her father. She says, ish, ish, ish. Now, what is ish? Ish, ish, ish means I. I. Ish is a German word for I. But I could hardly speak. She couldn't even speak when her father was around. And she still feels that she is unable to say anything in front of her father. And that reveals whenever she wanted to speak, she could only, stammer I. And she thought that I thought every German was you. She made of her father a prototype of all. And, now she refers to her father as a Nazi, and she'll compare herself to a Jew in a concentration camp for us to understand how she suffered at the hands of her father. And she mentions Dachau, Auschwitz, and Belsen. Now, these are all concentration camps. And she uses a Holocaust imagery the Holocaust imagery in Daddy and like Lazarus. And Holocaust, what do you mean by Holocaust? Holocaust or Shoah, the systematic state-sponsored killing of some 6 million Jews by the Nazi Germany and its collaborators during the World War II. And the Holocaust imagery likens Plath's struggle with power and suffering. That is why now she mentions this concentration camps, Dachau and Auschwitz and Belsen. And so you can well understand that she compares her father to a black shoe, to a Nazi. Even she says that refers to the swastika, the black swastika, which was a symbol of the Nazi party, the emblem, and a giant statue. Father, she says, was like a vampire. So this is a very strong comparison, you know. How could she possibly say such things about her father? But that is the thing. That is how her life was destined to be. She couldn't free herself from these patriarchal figures. First, her father, then we'll come to know about her husband, Ted Hughes. So, and then again, she compares the purity of the snow in Tyrol and the clear look of Vienna beer. These are all in stark contrast to the dark horrors that took place nearby in Nazi Germany. So the Nazis and the Germans, not all Germans, but especially the Nazis. Now, see, Sylvia Plath's father, Otto Plath, was not a Nazi himself. Neither her mother was Jewish. But she intentionally, the female speaker here, she intentionally creates this image of her father as a Nazi and compares herself to this, you know, persecuted Jew. Then she goes on to say that I've always been scared of you with your Luftwaffe, your gobbledygook. You see, Luftwaffe is again a German term for, you know, the Air Force, the German Air Force. But Clark uses this word not to mean an actual military, you know, air force, but the weapons of violence and words. And again, gobbledygook is something that doesn't communicate any sense. To her, not only the Nazis and the Germans, to her, the German language itself seemed to be obscene. And now, in stanza 13 of this poem, it's a very important stanza where the girl creates male number two based on her father. I made a model of you, a man in a black with a mind camped look. So here she, you know, tries to say that Ted Hughes, her husband, was simply a model of her father, nothing else. And now he has that Mein Kampf. The Mein Kampf is the title of Adolf Hitler's autobiography. It means my struggle. So he's also of similar type, and that he has sucked blood out of her for 7 years. And finally, she wants to break free. In particular, these limitations can be understood as patriarchal forces that enforce a strict gender structure. And finally, she had to perform a metaphorical murder, not a real murder, but a metaphorical murder. She had to murder her father and also her husband in order to free herself from this bondage. And in the last stanza, there's a stake in your fat black heart, and the villagers never liked you. They're dancing and stamping on you. They always knew it was you. Daddy, daddy, you bastard. I'm through. So She uses such a strong word like a bastard. But then who are these villagers? Are they the inhabitants of a village? Or is an allegory simply of Plath's own, imagination? Whatever it be, she no more considers herself subservient to man, and in order to free herself, she finally, you know, had to perform this metaphorical murder. She had to kill her father and also the image of a patriarchal figure. So, according to Robert Phillips, finally, the one way Plath was to achieve belief to become an independent self was to kill her father's memory. The ordered uh, memory, which in Daddy she does by a metaphorical method. So, that was Daddy. Now, let us discuss Lady Lazarus. It's a poem of 28 three-line stanzas and was written in the final few months of 1962. It was originally included in the Ariel. It's a bitter dramatic monologue, generally considered as an expression of Plath's suicidal attempts and thoughts. Now, the first thing that strikes us is the title of the poem. The readers might stop and think how to interpret this, and especially if they know about the biblical Lazarus, it would be easy for them to interpret. Now, Lazarus was, resurrected from the dead by Jesus Christ in the Gospel of John. You will find it. So we might think that this poem is one of victory over death. But we soon learn that Plath intends to identify with, with the Lazarus that is decaying in the tomb, not the Lazarus who has been brought back to life by Jesus Christ. So the female speaker's resurrection here also. Now here is a lady Lazarus. So the female speaker's resurrection by external forces suggests something more serious, especially from a feminist perspective. Now, Plath's inspiration for this title may have been the lines in T.S. Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, in which the dethroning hero imagines himself as Lazarus come from the dead, come back to tell you all. So, self destruction pervades the poem as it did Plath's life. And now, if we look at the very first stanza, I have done it again. 1 year in every 10. I manage it. So Plath says that she has done it again. What? She has tried to commit suicide again. 1 year in every 10. So she is trying this. She is trying to end her life once in every decade of her life. So she compares, and then in the second stanza, she compares a skin to a Nazi lampshade. Again, a Holocaust imagery. See, now claims her skin is bright as a Nazi lampshade, and that her face is a fine Jew linen. Now, what does that mean? Now, this is significant because of the idea that the Nazi people used to skin off the Jews to make their lampshades. The plot uses this horrifying metaphor to compare her own suffering to those of the Jews in the concentration camps. And the face is featureless, fine, Jew linen. Jew linen were used to, wrap the body of Lazarus before they laid him in the tomb. So, Plath's reference to the fine Jew linen shows that she already feels dead. Her near-death experiences, that is her, failed suicide attempts, according to her, was better than her life. And she blames people for, bringing her back to life, not allowing her to commit suicide. Plath identifies not with the resurrected Lazarus, but with the Lazarus. I just told you that she identifies with the Lazarus, decaying in the tomb. And this is why she describes herself as having and she thinks herself to be dead, as if she is dead. She wishes, and she describes herself as having a prominent nose cavity, eye pits, and teeth. So these figures, these those features would be most prominent in a decaying body. And she is no more a smiling woman. She reveals an obvious disappointment that she has not been able to die. And she compares herself to a cat and thinks that it will probably take many more attempts to end her life. And as she, she says that and like the cat, I have 9 times to die. And this is number 3. What a trash to annihilate each decade. Again, she tried to commit suicide, but she failed. So, people would, she thought that people would love to be entertained by her and not stand by her or comfort her. So, by committing suicide, she would end this pain. She thinks that it would be best to commit suicide rather than to live a life which is so suffocating. But then she realizes that she is alive and she wishes to be still in a tomb. Nevertheless, I am the same identical woman. The first time it happened, I was 10. It was an accident. So the first time, at the age of 10, she had this experience with death. And the second encounter with her own death, you can assume that she was around 20, and she explains this experience. The second time I meant to last it out and come back at all. So she desperately, wanted to end her life. Now, dying is an art. Plath so identifies with death more than life, more than anything else, that she says that dying is an art like everything else. I do it exceptionally well. She claims that death is her call, and she feels that it is meaningless to live. It's better to die. She reveals that she thinks it should be easy enough to end her life and stay put. She reveals that the hard part is coming back and facing the crowd because, she writes, what a million filaments the peanut crunching crowd shoves in to see. No, people will only view her as an, beautiful object and nothing else. So she feels that this is meaningless. She is not treated as a human being. And she really wants that she be treated like a woman who also has her aspirations and dreams to fulfill. Now, this Plath's preoccupation with this death reminds me of Mirza Ghalib's, one share where he says that मरते हैं आरज़ू में मरने की मौत आती है पर आती नहीं पर नहीं आती. So, want to die, but death doesn't come to me. So Plath is trying to say exactly that. But then again, Plath makes her readers aware of the source of her suffering, and she writes, so her doctor, so her enemy. Herr, her. So her is a German word for Mr. She again uses this German word, and it refers to the Nazi doctors who cured the Jewish victims only to resume their suffering. So, what could you probably do to me and her enemy, the patriarchal figures, the society dominated by the men? So, she sees them as her enemy. And when she says, I am your opus, I am your valuable, yeah, she wants us to understand that she is valuable to men just as an object, nothing else. So this is again a dehumanization and objectification of women in a society ruled by men. And she says this, I am your opus, I am your valuable. The poor gold baby that melts to a shriek. He feels that a death to the people around would be nothing more than watching a beautiful piece of jewelry burn in front of them. So the peanut crunching crowd. So, and she continues, ash, ash, you poke and stare, flesh bone, there is nothing there. Then again, she refers to the brutality of the Nazis. Now, the Nazis, they were known to use the remains of the burned Jewish bodies, and they made soaps out of that. So, can you imagine? So, she tries to make us understand how she feels and what her precarious condition is all about. She tries to break free, and in the next stanza, in the stanza number 27, Plath turns to a tone of revenge. She continues to blame men. She refers to her God, her Lucifer, all men who hold some kind of power over her, and she refers to them as, her God, her Lucifer. Now, in the last stanza of this poem, the poem anticipates it another dicing with death. Why? Because Plath says, out of the ash. Now, here comes the importance of the regeneration through the cycle of life and death. Out of the ash I rise with my red hair, and I eat men like air. So the speaker warns her enemies of her upcoming resurrection, asserting that she will rise and, like a phoenix, which she didn't explicitly mention, like a phoenix symbolizes a mythical creature, phoenix, because it rises from its own ashes. So she compares herself to a phoenix, and yes, this time she'll be back only to take revenge. She vows revenge, not only as a woman, but as a creative artist. She hopes that her work will be won. But first, she needs to react against this patriarchy. Now, to quote Eileen M. Ayr, if we categorize a poem such as Lady Lazarus as confessional or extremist, then we highlight only one of its elements. It is also a poem of social criticism. Now, this is important. With a strong didactic intent and a work of art which reveals great technical and intellectual ability. The hysteria is intentional and effective. So that's what she says. And, uh, you know, the literary devices used in this poem are, metaphor, assonance, and then you have imagery, you have hyperbole, to exaggerate any statement. For example, when she says to annihilate each decade, now this is a kind of a hyperbole. So, and also those imageries that I have discussed, Holocaust imagery. And now, let us see this. The feminist approach in Plath's Daddy and Lady Lazarus. Feminism is the advocacy of women's rights on the ground of, equality of the sexes. And Daddy surely reflects feminist views of, women's liberation and challenges stereotypical expectations of women's desire. Plath tries to revive the male oppressive design in the poems like Daddy and Lady Lazarus. Now, you can see that I already mentioned that the female speaker in Daddy, she had to perform a metaphorical murder of her father and husband, and she develops a personal fantasy of revenge and confrontation, defy the submissive norms and values represented by the two patriarchal figures. Now, who are those two patriarchal figures? Her father Otto Plath and her husband Ted Hughes. Now then again in Lady Lazarus identifies herself, the female speaker identifies herself with the Jewish victims and her exploitation by the enemy. And lastly, she fights back her tormentors. Why? In order to get a sense of selfhood and subjectivity. She wants to, you know, assert herself. Dr. Nima Matthew rightly observes that in restructuring the father image, she confronts a subjugated body and mind. It is an attempt for an imaginative seizure of the male world and a reposition of the female body. Thus, it becomes a vehicle for escape into autonomy. And another famous critic, George Steiner, considers the ritualistic recreating of this daddy as an act of identification, a total communion with those tortured and massacred. So, not only about her own self, there is an universal appeal to this poem, appeal in this poem, universal appeal, that many women who suffered at the hands of men can relate to Plath's precarious condition. Many critics have also analyzed Plath's poems in the context of the second wave of feminism. Now, it was a movement that focused on critiquing the patriarchal or male dominated institutions and cultural practices throughout the society. So, it can also be viewed in this light. Now, so the recurring themes in Lady Lazarus are death and victimization, self, patriarchy, womanhood, especially the dehumanization and objectification of women. So these are very important themes, and you know there is a biopic on Sylvia Plath. The name of the movie is Sylvia, and it was released in 2003. And Gwyneth Paltrow played the lead role in this movie. You can watch this movie; it's worth watching. Then you can also read Sylvia Plath's letters and unaveraged journals. They're available online. So she writes to her friend and former psychiatrist Ruth Besher. In one of her letters, she writes to her friend and alleges Ted Hughes and says that he beat me up physically. So we can, really know what kind of man, what kind of a husband Ted Hughes was. And to her mother, she once wrote, I am the girl that things happen to. So, now, see, many that live deserve death, and some that die deserve life. Now, Plath surely deserved to live, but the life she had was so suffocating that she couldn't breathe freely and finally succeeded in committing suicide at the age of 13. This is from the unabridged journals of Sylvia Plath. Perhaps someday I'll crawl back home, beaten, defeated, but not as long as I can make stories out of my heartbreak, beauty out of storm. She never came back. So that brings me to the end of my talk. I like to thank Professor Devashish Chatterjee for designing the slides of this presentation. It's from the Department of Computer Science, Jerusalem Memorial College, and also to Professor Orithro Banerjee from our own department as he is the technical coordinator of this academic exchange program. Thank you all. Thank you, dear students. Thanks for listening.
Sir, with your permission, I'm ending this live stream in YouTube.
Okay, okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
Thank you a
you.
lot.
Thank you.
Thanks.